on, let's talk about biodiversity. So biodiversity is the number and variety of different species in an area. So there's a multitude of different species in a specific area that is termed biodiversity. So healthy ecosystems have higher biodiversity with more resources available. So there's more food to eat, there's more resources for every organism to survive. So changes in biodiversity impacts the health of an ecosystem. If there's not as many species, there's not enough food for an organism, and that impacts the health of a whole ecosystem. And the diverse ecosystem is a stable, a productive, and it can also withstand environmental changes. So a lot of variety in that ecosystem, a lot of biodiversity is stable, it's productive, and it can withstand changes. Okay, so biodiversity has both economic and ecological value. So humans use ecosystems for profit. There's direct values and there's indirect values. Direct values are resources that are consumed. So food, medicinal purposes, medicine made of plants, lumber that we use for our houses, things like that are all direct values. Indirect values are resources that are used, but they're not consumed. So that could be things that like wetlands used for helping floods, spiritual practices, hiking, recreational use. All of these have values for humans. Okay, so again, there's value in biodiversity. There's direct values and indirect values. Direct, we consume. Indirect, we use, but we don't consume it. Okay, so things that we see, like hiking or going out into walks and seeing the biodiversity, those are all indirect values. Indirect values would be food, drink, like water, things like that. Okay, so again, there's also ecological value. Species are connected and they depend on each other for survival. So if we think back to when we learned about how the wolves changed the rivers, that video, the wolves were actually a keystone species. That means the species influences the survival of many other species. So if we think back to that video, without the wolves, it was just the deer and it was a barren ecosystem. There was like nothing there. But as soon as the wolves came in, a bunch of other organisms came and cultivated that ecosystem, making it more biodiverse. Okay, so trees and vegetation hold soil in place to prevent erosion. That's another value. Trees break up the rocks, and animal waste helps sustain the soil. Okay, it keeps the nutrients in the soil. Okay, so those are all ecological values. Okay, thinking on keystones again, keystone species, just another example, sharks are apex predators, and they feed on those rays, and the rays feed on like crabs and shrimp and things like that. Okay, and without the sharks, there's a bunch of rays, and they overpopulate, and then the population of the crabs and the shrimp and the bivalves, they all collapse because there's too many rays. They're eating all of the crabs and the shrimp. They can't survive. Okay, so without that shark, there's not a lot of biodiversity in there. Okay, so let's talk about factors affecting biodiversity. So one, we have niche diversity, and each niche provides an organism's biotic and abiotic resources, which is something we talked about already. And niches of different species can interact with each other. Okay, so it's not just one niche in isolation. Niches interact with each other. Okay. Species with narrow niches, such as a koala that only eats eucalyptus or pandas that only eat bamboo, they are more vulnerable to an environment change. So if suddenly the bamboo wiped out, pandas would be screwed. Okay, and competition occurs when resources are limited. So if there were less bamboo, the pandas would be competing for the resources available, the bamboo that's left. Okay, another factor is genetic diversity. That's the total makeup of an entire species. Okay, so if there's greater genetic diversity, there's an increased chance that a species can adapt and survive. If we look at the pictures of the giraffe, they have different patterns, all in the same species, that will help them adapt to different changes in their environment and therefore survive as a population. Okay, and if there's low genetic diversity, there's a chance that it's not going to survive. There's a lack of ability to adapt to those changes. Okay, so if the giraffe can camouflage better with a lighter skin than a orangier skin, then the lighter skin population would survive in the giraffe species. But it's important that they all have variation so that when or if a change occurs, they can adapt and change. Okay, and a gene pool is the number of genes available in a population. Okay. So let's talk about the third factor, that is species extinction. So over 90% of organisms that's ever lived is now extinct, which is crazy to think about because we think of the world as already so biodiverse. Okay, so just thinking about extinction, what is extinction? That is the disappearance of all members of a species from Earth. Okay, so like a dodo bird, that's always used as a example for an extinction. They are no longer on Earth. Okay, and then endangered, those are species that are endangered of becoming extinct. Endangered, in danger. Okay, they're in danger of becoming extinct. So there are two different types of extinctions. There's background extinction and mass extinction. Background extinction affects one species over a long period of time. That's due to environmental changes or a arrival of a new competitor or predator. Okay, so if there's an invasive species, which we'll talk about soon, that will lead to some background extinction or some endangerment of background extinction. Okay, so background extinction affects one species over a long period of time. Mass extinction, that affects many species over a shorter period of time. Okay, so mass, many, over a shorter period of time. That's due to rapid environmental changes, such as volcanic eruptions, changes in the air or in the water, pollution, things like that. Okay. And then there's other factors that affect biodiversity. There's climate and there's size of an ecosystem. So climate is known to, or it's inferred that consistent climate supports biodiversity. So if we look at the Amazon rainforest, the climate doesn't really fluctuate. It's not really cold one month and really hot another month. It's usually the same temperature. And that means there's a lot of biodiversity there. So if we look in the Amazon, there's a bunch of snakes, there's a bunch of different plants, there's a bunch of life and diversity in the Amazon because of the climate. Okay, and then also the size of an ecosystem. If we look at a larger area, there tends to be more biodiversity. Of course, if we look at one part of an ecosystem, there's going to be less diversity there if you look at a bunch of acres of that ecosystem. Okay. So let's talk about human impact on biodiversity. So sometimes we damage biodiversity. We cause harm to the habitats and the ecosystems. We remove natural resources like trees and in deforestation, and we increase levels of CO2. We also can bring in invasive species. So an invasive species is a non-native species that outcompetes native species in an ecosystem. So an example of this is actually a swan. A swan is an invasive species. They were brought into America due to the fact that they are pretty to look at. Okay, and that affects the native species, and they outcompete the native species here. Okay, and there's also poachers that illegally kill wildlife, as you see in that picture there. Okay, and sometimes we protect biodiversity. We want to keep biodiversity, and we know it's important, so we do these things to help protect it. We use captive breeding programs to help endangered species. In this picture, that's captive breeding of pandas, very cute. And we also have international laws and treaties to protect that biodiversity, to make sure the ecosystem is protected. Okay, we also preserve the habitat. The goal of preservation is to maintain a natural state of the ecosystem. You can see those in natural parks, in marine fisheries, and wildlife refuges. Okay, so if we look at a national park, there is not really much alterations to the ecosystem. The goal is to maintain that ecosystem and preserve it. And then we have global cooperation, and there's two treaties that help preserve the global diversity. There's Convention on Biological Diversity, and their focus is conservation. And there's a Convention on International Trade and Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, and that ensures that the trade of plants and animals do not endanger them. Okay. And that's all I have. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed a little bit of information on biodiversity.